Today, we are going to take a stroll down memory lane to look at the history of Highland Park, Michigan. Highland Park is featured in one of the Sylvia Wilcox stories, and it has been in the news quite a bit over the past few years. So I thought it would be fun to take a look at how the city of Highland Park that we see in 2023 came to be. I was born at a hospital just outside of Highland Park, and my childhood home was about 15 minutes from the city's border. So this is a place that I'm familiar with, and it's interesting to see how it's changed over the years. So when I started looking into this, I thought, okay, I know a lot about Highland Park and its history. There's not that much to know, but I was shocked. There is a lot more to the story. So let's get started. Highland Park is a city in southeastern Michigan. It is less than 3 square miles and is surrounded by Detroit and Hamtramck. So it is a city located within another city. In the 1800s, there were quite a few attempts to try to make the place a village. At the time, it was a small farming community, and it was right outside of Detroit. So it was a good place for people to go if they wanted to escape high taxes or just be outside of the city. The first attempt to make Highland Park a village occurred in 1825 when Augustus B. Woodward, a prominent Detroit judge, attempted to establish a village. But Woodward wasn't able to complete the task, so the area continued to be a rural swath of land filled with farms. Another judge, Benjamin F. Witterall, tried to establish a village in the same area in 1836, but once again, his efforts failed. Then, in 1860, a post office was established. Over the years, the post office closed and reopened several times. Eventually, the area was absorbed into Greenfield and Hamtramck townships, 2 townships that would eventually disappear. But in the 1860s, there was a push by local businessmen to spruce up the area that would become Highland Park. Woodward, a main artery in Detroit, expanded through the rural enclave. People did not want the city to dead end into a very rural area. Of course, developers will come along and they will want to develop everything. And that's basically what was happening. These businessmen, they saw an opportunity to really expand Detroit. And that's kind of what they were shooting for. But in 1881, a man named William Henry Stevens bought 113 acres, complete with a beautiful home in the rural area just outside of Detroit. Now, he had previously lived on Woodward Avenue in Detroit. In fact, his house was located where the current main library in downtown Detroit stands. So he was familiar with the area, and he was looking to get away from the high taxes inside of Detroit while still being very close to the city. So this was a way for him to do that. He named his estate Highland Park because it was on a little bit of an incline. It was higher up than where he had lived in Detroit. Stevens started the Highland Park Railway, which helped ferry people up and down Woodward Avenue, and he also opened the Highland Park Hotel. In 1873, a post office was established again, and the area was called Whitewood. Next, subdivisions were built, and Stevens continued to develop the area. And by 1888, people living in the vicinity wanted sewers and street lamps and other amenities one finds in the city. The Michigan legislature debated whether or not Highland Park should be incorporated. Most residents didn't want incorporation because of all the laws and taxes that come with such a designation. The legislature compromised and decided to allow Highland Park to designate itself as an unincorporated village, but there would be a buffer of land between Highland Park and Detroit because there was a real fear that at some point Detroit was just going to gobble up the land, and people did not want that, mainly because of the taxes. But they also liked that Highland Park was a little bit, it was rural. It wasn't a city. So on June 27th, 1889, the new village's name was officially changed to Highland Park. But Highland Park was growing, and it was going to need police, water, sewage services, fire protection, all the stuff that you need in a city. So there started to be talk that it would make more sense to simply annex the land into Detroit. But the residents of Highland Park didn't want that. But it seemed like the investors who had been building up the area, all the subdivisions and things like that, they kind of wanted that. They wanted Highland Park to become part of Detroit. With the exceptions of Stevens. He did not seem to want that. He wanted Highland Park to be its own entity. After a battle between the two sides, the border of Detroit is moved 1.5 miles north. And today that area in Detroit would be the Boston Edison district and other neighborhoods in that vicinity, upscale homes, really nice area. It does feel a little bit different than the rest of Detroit that is in that area, but it doesn't feel like Highland Park. So this annexation occurs. Highland Park is again in jeopardy because all of their government officials most of them live in what has now become part of Detroit. So Highland Park is on the defense again, and they're fighting to stay alive as a city, or at least as an unincorporated village at this time. And there's a court case that Highland Park has started against the Detroit and Birmingham Plank Road Company. And basically, they want the company to move their toll road because it's inside of what would be the village of Highland Park. But the company says that Highland Park is no longer a legal entity because of what happened with the annexation, the 1.5 mile north annexation. So they're saying, oh, you're not even a real place. We don't have to do anything. Well, the Supreme Court of Michigan agrees with Highland Park. And Highland Park, at that point, people start to recognize it as the unincorporated village it wants to be. The reason that this was so difficult for people to accept, a lot of people, they just didn't want to accept it as a legal entity, is because at this point, it is a farming community. Things are spread out. It has less than 500 people in the 1900 census. And, people just looked at it like farmland. And there was kind of this attitude, why not just annex it? It would make more sense. But the people that lived there did not want that. So this is just a little quiet community. And then Henry Ford announces that he was going to be building a factory for the Model T production. And that's when the population explodes. So Henry Ford makes the announcement in 1907, and the plant opens January 1st, 1910. The city's population increased over 800% between 1900 and 1910. It set records for gains in population. And by 1918, once again, we've got more, whispers about, oh, we should just annex it. And that is when Highland Park becomes a city. They've got enough people. They've got the tax base. Also, it's important to note that Henry Ford, he chooses the unincorporated village of Highland Park because he, too, like a lot of businesses, even to this day, they want to escape the high taxes of Detroit. Detroit is not a business-friendly city in a lot of cases because of the high taxes. And apparently that was true back then, too. So Henry Ford, he buys up acreage and he's like, good, I'm not in the city. I don't have to worry about that. So, but now that it's a city, cities have largely the same problems. You've got this big employer. You've got, everybody's flocking there to work. They're making their $5 a day and all that good stuff. But obviously, you're going to start seeing those taxes kick in that Henry Ford didn't want. Now, Ford is not the only automotive juggernaut to take up residence in Highland Park. In 1925, Chrysler Corporation purchased the old Brush Motors site and set up its headquarters. Another thing to remember is that in the first half of the 1900s, there were scores of automobile companies. Most did not last very long. In 1900, there were over 100 automobile companies. By 1955, there were only 5 companies making cars in the United States. Much like mining towns, many automotive cities saw a profitable boom cycle that eventually ended. Highland Park is a prime example of boom and bust. People flocked to Highland Park for the lucrative automotive jobs. Houses were built, businesses were started, and the city became one of the best places to live out the American dream. So let's take a look at how all of this unfolds. So here we go. This is how people flock to the city, and then we will be able to see through this chart when the population starts to decline. So here's a timeline. So in 1900, Highland Park had 427 people living in the village. Ford bought land in Highland Park and announced the Model T factory in 1907. In 1910, the population had climbed to 4,120 people. And then it jumps again between 1910 and 1920 by over 1,000%. In 1925, Chrysler moves to Highland Park, and this is important too because Chrysler actually keeps their headquarters there for the next 70 years. Then, in 1927, Ford announces that production of the Model T will be moved to Dearborn, Michigan. Now, there were still things going on in the the plant in Highland Park, but the Model T was, the big deal at that time. So they move it to Dearborn so that they can focus on quality and all that good stuff. Because Henry Ford had a residence in Dearborn, so he would be right there. He'd be able to monitor it. But there were still things going on in that Ford factory in Highland Park. In fact, Ford still owns the factory. They aren't really actively making anything there, but they still own it and use it for storage and things like that. Tanks for World War II were made in that factory, and they didn't cease all production until 1974. In 1930, Highland Park hit its population peak of 52,595 people. So, as we can see, it's been almost 100 years since Highland Park hit its peak. But while the departure of the Model T production plant made Highland Park slightly less desirable from a worker perspective, it was still a beautiful city that some called the City of Trees. I've heard that name for several different cities, but Highland Park was one of them that was called the City of Trees. And it had these beautiful paved alleys and stately homes. And it was a short drive from the heart of Detroit, a very desirable place to live. So why did it hit its peak population in 1930? And what made people start to turn away from Highland Park? So this is where we have to pull back the curtain a little bit. Southeastern Michigan has always been a bit of a rough place. And if we're honest, Michigan in general, kind of a rough place. People from all walks of life and different backgrounds, religions, socioeconomic levels, they come together and they clash, and there's like this uneasy coexistence, right? You may remember a video I made last year about the Witch of Delray, or there also was one about St. Albans Street Massacre, the one that took place in the 20s. In those cases, if you read the newspaper articles that were written in Detroit at the time about those cases, they really focus on the victims' backgrounds. Like the family that was murdered on St. Albans Street, they were Italian, and the father had started his own religion and stuff like that. So that was like, people were like, oh yeah, he's very strange. And then in the Witch of Delray, the woman, she was from a different part of the world that people weren't familiar with. So that meant that they kind of viewed her in a way that they wouldn't have if maybe she had been born in Detroit or had been like a second generation immigrant or something like that. So that is important to remember. It still is something that happens in Michigan today. And I mean, really everywhere. But if you live in Michigan, then you know that these different groups, they come together and they clash a lot. So to set the scene, we've got Highland Park, good jobs, people have moved there. One of the really good jobs is kind of going away, or at least there's going to be a reduction in the amount of people that can work at the Model T factory. This obviously makes people more uncomfortable, a little bit meaner, maybe more tribal. And, of course, we also have the Great Depression, which in Michigan hit really, really hard because Michigan is a place that has long been dependent on one industry. And even though people loved their automobiles, generally you could get along without it because this was something that a lot of people, they already didn't have automobiles, or there was a train that they could take or whatever. They had other ways to get around. So, like, people just stopped buying cars, and it devastated the Michigan economy, which is something that that happens again in 2008 because Michigan still focused on this one industry. Okay, so that is to set the scene. Now, the group that we're going to talk about today is called the Black Legion, and it was a white supremacist group. But it's important to note that in Michigan at this time, there are several groups like based on race or religion or ethnic background that are forming, almost like, just a bunch of gangs or whatever. So the Black Legion is one of those. And it actually forms in, chapter, the Michigan chapter was formed in Highland Park by Arthur Lapp. And it is like a spinoff of the Ku Klux Klan. There had been like kind of some animosity in the Klan because one of the leaders was arrested for a crime where he bit this woman up. He raped her and he bit her, and the police said it looked like a cannibal had attacked her and things like that. So some of the men in the Ku Klux Klan decided to form another group called the Black Legion. And so Arthur Lapp lived in Highland Park, and he was in charge of the chapter. In order to join the Black Legion, you needed to be a white American male and you needed to be Protestant. So if you were Catholic, if you were born in another country, or if you're female, you could not join. So the Black Legion basically rode around. They did night riding, just like the Klan, where they would go around and, make sure they would tell people, you can't be in this neighborhood or whatever, chase people out. They would pistol whip people, and sometimes they would kill people. Members of the Black Legion held positions of power in Highland Park's government and Detroit's government as well, which suggests that there was more to this city than just beautiful homes and, the automotive jobs. And remember, we're talking about 1936 here at this point. We're in the, Great Depression is going on full swing, and we've already had some of the jobs move out of town. It's a very small place. They're not attracting new businesses because, once again, it's little, and without the Ford plant employing as many people instantly started moving out. You also have, other people who didn't work there who may have migrated to another state looking for work because we're in the midst of the Great Depression. So there's a man named Charles Poole. He's French-Canadian and Catholic, and he's an unemployed auto worker, and he gets murdered by the Black Legion. Now, stories differ on exactly why he was murdered by them, other than he was French-Canadian and Catholic, and he was married to a Protestant woman whose brother-in-law was in the Black Legion. Allegedly, the brother-in-law told the members of the Black Legion that Charles Poole had been violent with his wife. So he exaggerated an argument they had, and the Black Legion used it as an excuse to kill Charles Poole. But that's not the only murder that the Black Legion committed. In fact, it is thought that they killed at least 50 people. And so the Wayne County prosecutor, who was also rumored to be a member of the Black Legion, prosecuted the men, and several of them were given life sentences, some of which were commuted by various Michigan governors later. Others got between 3 and 10 years for participating in the kidnapping and, I guess, just knowing about the murder. Now, you may be thinking, okay, was this Black Legion thing really a big deal? I've never heard of them.
We don't take no lip from nobody.
Yeah, that's the stuff. Hit 'em hard and quick. We ain't afraid of nothing and nobody, are we?
3 years from the Black Legion. Come on, what's the matter with God?
Don't you?
Dope.
Soldier of the Black Legion, you see before you an instrument of death. We give you this half as a symbol of our trust. The other half you will receive the day you betray that trust.
You've been lying to me.
Don't you call me a liar.
You're Frank. You did have something to do with all those terrible things. You and those new friends of yours.
You shut up about my friends.
I won't. Only a bunch of dirty, contemptible cowards would do a thing like that.
Are you? Then kill me for telling you. Them Black Legion guys don't fool.
I'm not fooling either. You're going to quit that gang.
I can't get out. Nobody ever lived to get out of the Legion.
Stop him! Don't let him get away! They're going to get away!
So that was a trailer for a movie called The Black Legion. And it stars Humphrey Bogart. It won some awards, and it is about just the Black Legion in this particular case with Charles Poole. Newspaper articles around the world reported on the death of Charles Poole. Orson Welles had an episode on his radio show that was loosely based on the Black Legion. I believe it was called the White Legion. So this was a big deal at the time. And also, Detroit was known, like I said, it's a scrappy place. I know people don't like to say that about it, but as a native Detroiter, I could tell you it's a scrappy place. And if you learn about the history, there are all these gangs and things that operate. Detroit also started Prohibition early. earlier than the rest of the country. So there were already gangs that were doing things by the time the Great Depression came, like criminal organizations. So it wasn't so weird to have something like this pop up. It's just that this particular group, they ended up, lots of them went to prison and were suspected of murdering so many people. All of these groups were murdering people, no doubt. But these guys, they kind of got caught. So that's why it becomes a movie and people are talking about it and things like that. So, and I'm watching that movie in a few days for date night because I've never heard of it. Okay, so what does all this have to do with the Highland Park that we see in 2023? If you don't know much about Highland Park, I'll just give you a few pointers on what's going on there currently. Currently, Highland Park, they are negotiating a water bill that they need to pay because the city is millions of dollars behind on water bills. This is not the first time that the city has had trouble paying the utilities. I believe it was 2011 when the street lamps were removed from most of Highland Park because the city had not been paying the electric bills. Now, Highland Park is a kind of dangerous place. You really do want street lamps there. And after they were removed, they just asked people, hey, please turn on your porch lights so that, people can see. Really crazy stuff. Also, Chrysler left Highland Park in 1992, and that was pretty much it because between Ford and Chrysler, like these were large companies, they were paying a lot in taxes, and when they leave Highland Park, so you have Ford finally just completely shutting down operations in the 70s, and then you have Chrysler leaving in the 90s. I mean, there's just nothing else in the city. During the 90s, after Chrysler announces that they're leaving, the hospitals in Highland Park began to close as well. And at this point, they don't have a high school. They don't have many businesses at all. And there's still a lot of corruption going on in Highland Park, which is some of what I wrote about in Badges, the Sylvia Wilcox story that I just finished. So the way that this happens is we get up to 2000, 2001, and the state of Michigan is at a point where, like I just told you, the businesses have left, people have left, the population just has really dwindled. So by the time we get to 2000, they've got 16,746 people. And 2000, 2001, or around that time, the state of Michigan decides to take over the city's finances. So they send in what they call an emergency manager to manage things. And when they do that, they do something that is fascinating to me. They disband the police department and they put the Wayne County sheriffs in charge of policing Highland Park, but they leave all of the evidence and files for crimes in Highland Park in the police station. Well, unfortunately, after they dissolved the police department, no one is in the headquarters with the evidence and the files. And what happens is that people break in. Some of them go in there for the copper wire and things like that. Others just go in there because they're shocked that they can just rummage through police evidence and files and look up their friends and see, hey, did you commit this crime? And, things like that. So that actually happens. Michigan also goes through a single state recession in 2001. And I believe that may be why it took until 2007 to reinstate the Highland Park Police Department. By that time, we've got 6 years that have passed, people rummaging through all the files and evidence. There was evidence from the 1960s down there, files of all types of crimes. I mean, you could just go in there and just rummage through them. I do have some pictures here from some urban explorers, and I know some people were saying, well, when this group went in and did this, and put it on their website, some people were saying, oh my gosh, you're breaking the law, blah, blah, blah. Well, here's the thing. I'm glad that they did it because it's important for taxpayers to see how their money is being spent, right? And also see that, hey, whoever committed crimes before 2001 in Highland Park, you're good. You're not going to jail because all the evidence has been tampered with. And who knows, maybe your file is gone, you know? So this is just a crazy thing that happened. And for it to be like that for 6 years it just shows you extreme dysfunction. And it probably makes you realize that, you wouldn't want to live there. At this point in 2023, Highland Park is hanging on by a thread, and there are efforts to try to revitalize the city. But honestly, if we look at the history of it, it's just not in a great position to be a city on its own unless it has one of those big corporate employers that comes and moves in, supplies jobs, and pays a lot of taxes. It's just not big enough. And it also is bordered by Detroit and a little bit of Hamtramck. Now, Hamtramck is another city within the city. They were just suburbs of Detroit that, the city of Detroit has grown around. And the problem is that Highland Park can't chart its own destiny because of where it's located. If you go to downtown Detroit now, which isn't that far from Highland Park, it's been built up. It looks great. There's lots of investment into it. But because Highland Park is a different city, they don't get any of that. So somebody has to come in and invest in Highland Park. And a few months ago, somebody came out and said they were going to invest $10 billion into the city, which I think is crazy because Highland Park doesn't quite have it doesn't have enough room or space to have its own destiny at this point. Whatever happens in Detroit is going to happen in Highland Park. And because it is not, it's close to downtown, but it's not right next to downtown. As soon as you get out of downtown Detroit, when you hit Highland Park because there's nothing. There's a bunch of closed shops and things like that you'll see along Hamilton Avenue. I mean, it just looks like a total ghost town. And you also still have a lot of corruption. I know they say they're always trying to clean it up, but I'll give you an example of very recent corruption. And it was about a marijuana dispensary. This couple, they bought this old church that is vacant in Highland Park, and they set up their like a marijuana grow thing or whatever. So the mayor at the time was Herbert Yop, and the police chief was Kevin Coney, and they seized this business on Christmas Eve in 2020. They claimed that they went in there to do a fire inspection, and it turned out that there was this illegal grow operation, but the couple that started the grow operation had gone through all the right legal channels to set it up, so it wasn't illegal. So then the couple, they try to get their building back, their business back, and they're not charged with a crime, but the city of Highland Park holds the building, won't let them back in there, and so they don't report the forfeiture either. So there's really nothing on paper. It's just that they just are telling these people they can't go in this building, they can't run their business. And then they ask, well, are we going to be charged with a crime? No charges. What ends up happening is that the Highland Park officials, they tell the couple, well, you can have the building back if you buy 2 police cars for the city of Highland Park. And I mean, this is really shady. So that happened in 2020. The people that were responsible for that, I know that there's a new police chief and a new mayor, which is great. But when things like this happen in a city that can't really pay businesses to go to them, it clears up why Highland Park is in such bad shape and probably won't be recovering anytime soon, because this is, high-level corruption. And it's so blatant because they told these people, hey, buy 2 police cars for the city and then we'll give you back your marijuana grow business. Really strange. So that's a little bit more about Highland Park. I am going to do a full episode on the Black Legion because I was talking to my dad today and he said, I've never heard of them. And I know that a lot of people haven't because, like I said, I have found one book about them, and it's also about baseball, and it's about the year where Detroit won, all the sports teams won the national championships. So there's a lot of information about that in there. But this guy actually, he writes about the Black Legion as well because his uncles would come to his house in the 1970s and tell him stories and things like that. But when I mentioned this group to my friends and family members, most of whom are in Michigan, well, nobody's really heard of them. So stay tuned for an episode on that. And I'd like to talk a little bit more about some of the abandoned buildings, like what they used to be before they fell into disarray, because Highland Park, Detroit, Hamtramck, all these places, just beautiful architecture that has fallen into ruins. Some of them are being rebuilt, which is really great to see. So I'd like to examine a little bit of that because the architecture is just stunning. So that's all for now. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.